Hi, I'm Thomas Broadhead. I'm the editor of the Critical Performance edition of the Ives 4th Symphony. And in this video, we're going to talk about the alternative snare drum part and the BU. So here we're looking at the first page of the finale, and it begins with the percussion alone, sounding out its cycle. Then, on the next page, the basses enter. Well, what's going on with the BU? Well, it's playing a 7-measure cycle that, except for the Indian drum part in 2 places, repeats inexorably through the movement. The percussion here are doing a variation on a drummer's street cadence of dun, 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 dun. It has a swell to it, and except for the snare drum part, it's exactly 7 measures long. So what's up with the snare drum? Well, it's repeating that pattern, dun, 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 spread out over 5 half notes. Notice it ends with a half rest. Now watch what happens when it gets to the end of the page. Dun, 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 dun. We go to the next page, expecting to see the half rest, and boom, it's not there. It doesn't have the half rest to complete the pattern. It goes right back to the da at the beginning of the cadence. So rightly, it should be dun, 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 dun. But instead, what you get is dun, 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 with no break between the 2 cells. Now, why is the half rest missing? The snare drum pattern is otherwise consistent through the movement, and it never again omits the half rest. So why is this the case? Well, it's because of the way that Ives went about composing and writing the opening of the movement. In the manuscript, the piece originally began with the percussion and the basses sounding together. But then Ives changed his mind, and he drew brackets around the BU, and he wrote a note. Drums will play percussion theme alone equal 7 measures. It's clear he means for the BU percussion to sound alone first, and after they complete a statement of their cycle, then to bring in the basses. So, in the score, the piece begins with the percussion sounding alone on the first page. Then their material is repeated verbatim on the second page, with the basses entering there. Incidentally, this is what was done also in the 1965 score, so it's nothing new in this edition. Now, back to the percussion cycle. Unfortunately, when Ives had the idea to have the percussion sound alone for 7 measures and then have the basses enter, he forgot that the snare drum doesn't actually complete its cycle over those 7 measures. It needs another half rest to do that. And that rest would have to go on the next page in the published score. But that's where Ives has the BU repeat everything verbatim from the first page. And the snare drum starts its cycle there with a struck note, not a half rest. So, rightfully, if you've started the piece here with the percussion playing by themselves, then the snare drum needs a half rest right at the start of page 2 to continue its pattern. But that can't work. So this is an oversight in Ives's thinking when he was working this out. But when you realize this, what do? Well, you could just shift the snare drum material over by a half rest for the rest of the movement, but that wouldn't be tenable at all. Ives is writing all the BU material in terms of how it interacts with the OU, the main orchestra, according to the temporal rondo plan that we discussed before. So the rest of the BU writing must be respected and retained as is. If that's the case, what do you do about the snare drum cycle? Well, fellow Ives scholar Wayne Shirley had the idea of shifting the snare drum's music backwards by a half rest, so that there's a half rest at the end of the last measure on the first page. That way, the snare drum cycle starts anew on the first beat of the next page when the basses enter. So, if you do that, you get the notation here and the alternative snare drum part. So, this is Wayne's idea for how to solve this, if and only if it is important to you. In other words, to make the snare drum part consistent. Although Wayne's solution has the snare drum starting mid-cycle at the beginning, which isn't ideal. Wayne also drops the initial beat in the snare drum that really should occur when you shift the music over like this. There should be an 8th rest followed by a dotted quarter here. Wayne omitted this apparently because he felt the movement should start with the instruments striking their notes in unison, not with the snare drum coming in effectively an 8th rest late. It seems odd to me, though, to omit that note, but I've retained Wayne's solution here. Now, I've heard this alternative snare drum part used in concert. Frankly, I don't really like the way it sounds. I think it works much better with the snare drum starting its cycle right there on the first beat of the music. Notice the snare drum is playing the drummer's cadence. Dun, 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 dun. Wayne's solution has the second part of the cadence sounding first. So you end up with dun, dun, dun as the first thing you hear. And it doesn't start until the end of the first measure. So musically, I don't believe it works well, but in deference to Wayne and his scholarship, I've put it in as an alternative. Now, what about the letters above the BU measures? Well, if measure 1 is here on the second page with the basses entering, then the measures on the first page don't have numbers, right? They would properly have measures like -1, -2, and so on, but we're not going to do that. So here we've used letters A, B, C, D, E, F, G to indicate the first 7 measures. So that's how the finale begins, with these lettered measures for the percussion cycle, with or without the alternative snare drum part. And then on the next page, you get to the actual measure 1 with the basses entering. So the alternative snare drum part points out an interesting aspect of how Ives conceptualized this movement originally, and then how he revised his thinking about it, which I think is the right thing to do. I think the music works much better with the percussion starting alone and then having the basses enter on the next page. But fixing the snare drum cycle to correct Ives's oversight like this is really a matter of taste, and it has the disadvantage of making the snare drum begin mid-cycle. I don't particularly care for it, but others might. So it's provided in the edition for the interpreter to use or not to use.